Welcome to Raising the Bar with RebuttalPR, the podcast where we elevate the stories of the plaintiff's bar and dive into the key trends shaping the civil justice system today. I'm your host, Ray DeLorenzi, and in each episode, we'll bring you insightful interviews with leading attorneys, expert perspectives on current legal events, and in-depth discussions on the issues that matter most. Now let's jump in.
Knowing how meaningful it is to be able to stand there with a client, and because, even if you don't always win, the fight is so important. There's an element of just helping to give people agency over what's happening in their lives that I think is so important. And I know that I'm doing it with some of the best and most amazing people in the country, so I feel very, very lucky.
Hey everyone, welcome back to a new episode of Raising the Bar with RebuttalPR. I'm your host, Ray DeLorenzi, and today I'm joined by Sharon McGowan, the CEO of Public Justice. For any lawyer there at home who's not familiar with public justice, you need to get out from under your rock, I'd say. Public justice has been around for more than 40 years and is one of, if not the premier nonprofit legal advocacy organization in the United States, and is doing incredibly important work for civil justice and justice issues generally in a very important time in our nation. So Sharon, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for asking me to join you.
So let's just start with, for those, and I sort of scratch my head, if you're not familiar with public justice and you're in the plaintiff's bar, why don't you tell those, listening at home or on their run or in their car a bit about public justice?
Absolutely. So public justice has been around for over 40 years, and we were founded at a time where, this is going to sound cute and maybe even a little bit quaint, but the fear was that then President Ronald Reagan was just going to hand the keys over to the corporations and let them run roughshod over the little guy. And so this was a fierce band of trial lawyers who knew that certainly the government has a role, but the government's never going to save us. In some ways, we really need the ferocity of fearless trial lawyers to make sure that rights on paper actually are meaningful rights in people's lives. And so that was, the genesis of, what was then called Trial Lawyers for Public Justice. Now the organization is known as Public Justice, but in many ways, our mission is not only the same, but perhaps as vital as ever, because now we don't necessarily have somebody handing the keys, although they are handing the keys, they're actually handing the passwords over to some of the richest and most powerful people in the country. And so our organization continues to exist to make sure that we are working on behalf of consumers and workers and students and families and protecting the environment from those people who would get away with whatever they could if there wasn't somebody watching. And so we're there to kind of make sure that we fill that gap.
A little bit later, I want to get into the work that public justice is doing today, particularly in, let's call it, interesting time in our nation's history. But I want to talk about you and your background first, because you have such a fascinating background. You were a practicing lawyer at Katz Banks in Cumin, which is, a tremendous plaintiff side law firm. You were at ACLU, DOJ, OPM, and I'm probably forgetting one or two other just like amazing sort of achievements in your career that, led you to today becoming CEO of Public Justice. I'm curious, like when you were young, was there a moment where you're like advocating on behalf of individuals is what I want to be doing in my life? Tell me about how you got to this moment.
Yeah, it was funny. I was thinking about that. On the one hand, some of this I attribute to being a middle child of four. And people always like, don't you realize that 4 is an even number? But when you're the second child who gets bumped by twins who come after you, you need to figure out kind of how to kind of claim the stage a little bit. So I think I found my voice there at an early age to make sure that I didn't get lost in the shuffle of an Irish Catholic household with a lot of kids running around. And I also think it was very funny because, my profile isn't necessarily one that would expect, someone to wind up being, sort of a plaintiff side civil rights advocate. My father was a New York City police officer. The grandparents came over from Ireland. We can make a nice little pub song out of the whole thing. So we had kind of a little bit of a Law and Order vibe, in the house, from when I was growing up. But even when we were watching Law and Order, my dad maybe would be leaning into the order side, and I'd be the one being like, "Wait a minute, didn't they just search that homeless guy's shoebox? Isn't that his private property?" And so from an early age, I think there was enough of sort of a law vibe going on in the house that I discovered that I I had an enjoyment for standing up for the little guy, whether it was, my dog maybe who got himself in trouble from bringing in, a toy that he wasn't supposed to bring in. And then my father was accusing me of being a kunstler, which I was used maybe as a dirty word in our house, but I've come to sort of take on as a badge of honor for somebody who would defend the hard cases. And so then from that point on, I think being engaged, both politically, but also just finding those different ways to find my voice. I think is sort of what sort of set me on a path of advocacy, even if I didn't necessarily call it that when I was growing up.
Were there, when you're, not even necessarily younger, but going through, university, law school, specific civil rights leaders that, really inspired you and, reinforced this passion?
I was thinking about different memories that I have, political memories, and I would say in many ways, I came of age politically when I went to undergraduate, which is, I would always describe to people as my first experience living abroad, right? Because here I was, this kid from Queens, who went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and had the opportunity to meet people from not only sort of different parts of the country, but frankly even from different parts of the state of Virginia. Which, for those who kind of know the demographics of Virginia, you have the Northern Virginia folks, sort of the military folks down from Virginia Beach, the more conservative folks from Southwest and Southwest Virginia, and so I found myself learning about different perspectives that I didn't sort of have exposure to growing up in a very diverse but still relatively blue collar conservative background in Queens. And then towards the end of my first year of undergraduate, we had the Rodney King verdicts that resulted in the unrest. And that was my first time experiencing what I would describe as like a major political event away from home. And I remember sort of sitting with colleagues and, friends of mine who were African-American students from Gary, Indiana, and from Los Angeles, and, kind of looking at me as sort of this, Irish kid from Queens whose dad was a cop. And we started to really engage in these conversations about what was happening, what it meant, and what kind of world did we want to live in. So, again, I always sort of think it's funny to sort of have my background and do this work, but then also to say, and then I went to the University of Virginia and came out this raging progressive. People are like, that's not usually how that works. But, when you are kind of plugged into the events, of the day, and you surround yourself with really smart people who want to challenge you to grow beyond maybe sort of the experience that you had up until that point. I always sort of feel like that was absolutely one of the pivotal moments. And then leading into that summer, I think in many ways one of my first political memories was seeing Barbara Jordan at the 1992 Democratic National Convention, right? And at that point, I didn't know that I was someone who identified as LGBTQ. I certainly didn't know that Barbara Jordan was somebody who was LGBTQ, and that was not a prominent part of her identity sort of publicly at that time. But I still remember, seeing her coming out onto the stage, in her wheelchair and addressing, the convention. And, even looking back and watching that speech, there's a lot about it that is really very much sort of that moment in time and where our politics are very different. But I think of those two events really as my political coming of age and the opportunity for me to not necessarily just be being holden to sort of where I came from and actually sort of making the choices about, the life that I wanted and the community that I wanted to build.
So earlier in your career, you were a staff attorney with the LGBT and AIDS projects of the ACLU. And I want to talk about when you went there, was it a much obviously different time than today? Was it terrifying? Was it like empowering? Was it like, what were the emotions involved in being in that role when, again, the Americans' views of, of gay people were so different. And I think people forget, like, Barack Obama was, hedged on it until Joe Biden forced it. So it's just a much different era. And I'm curious what that experience was like.
Coming out, right before I started law school, in many ways really sort of defined the path that I expected to take, because, there were folks who were like, I'm going to go work at the Justice Department. I'm like, I'm an openly gay person. Like, I'm not going to go work at the Justice Department. Like, that's not for me, right? And even sort of in the choices that I made, I was one of 4 out people in my class of 500 at Harvard Law School, because it was like so outrageous and you couldn't possibly expect to get a real job, if you were out. And so, I sort of always look back and think, my 1L summer, I spent part of it at the ACLU with the First Amendment Project, and then part of the summer with the National Center for Lesbian Rights. And then for my 2L summer, I was going to show them, that an openly gay person could get a job in big law. So I went and I summered at Cravath. I really showed them, and look, I had a great experience at Cravath. I learned a lot, and there are really some amazing civil rights advocates who had a little moment of sort of driving through, sort of the Cravath experience. But I remember sort of being like, okay, like this is not sort of where I fit either. But I think I'd always sort of known that an advocacy role, because of just how marginalized my identity was inherently going to kind of be where I was likely to sort of dedicate my energies. But yeah, I mean, when I first got to, the ACLU, I mean, I was very fortunate in the sense that my experience prior to that had been as an associate at Jenner and Block working on the Lawrence versus Texas case, right? Which is, again, one of those right place, right time. And so in many ways, that was this incredible sea change moment where the Supreme Court had finally struck down the remaining criminal sodomy bans, in the states where that still existed. So we were in that moment of feeling like, okay, we had finally sort of freed ourselves from this badge of inferiority, and now we were sort of charting a path going forward. But I will say, those first couple of years, even when we started to experience some victories, and then in 2004 we saw the wave of constitutional amendments, basically weaponizing the political process to kind of bring out the more conservative base. And I was kind of very despondent and went in to talk to some of my colleagues, and they said, look, this is how it goes. We litigated through the 80s where we were losing our colleagues, they were dying because of government indifference. So now I feel like in some ways I draw on that experience, knowing that we're now facing another one of these like incredible experiences of retrenchment, and knowing that guidance that was offered to me as a baby lawyer of how this is sort of part of what we do, right? We pick ourselves up and keep going. But you're right, it was definitely a time that was both exciting, but it certainly, we were at a very different place, even in terms of sort of public awareness and public acceptance of the issues that are much more mainstream now.
I want to talk about your role in the Billington case. Uh, it's a landmark Title VII case. It established new protections for transgender individuals against employment discrimination. I'm curious what your approach and thinking was when litigating that case. And then I want to talk about, and you touched on this a little bit in your last answer, but do you feel like some of this stuff is getting litigated again today, but like publicly? It's like what's old is new again in a kind of horrific way,
Yeah. I will say, just to that last piece, one of the things that, again, you have to be somewhat of a perpetual optimist to keep sort of sticking your finger in the electric socket and know that you're going to kind of keep getting zapped, but you're kind of steeled for it a little bit more every time you do it. But I do take comfort in knowing that every time I see the other side's argument need to change, that is a sign of the fact that we're winning, right? Because you think about the ways in which arguments about LGBT people, trans people in particular, sort of evolved sort of over time. It used to start from a place of just being able to say the most like outrageous, horrific things. And again, we're sort of back where some of that is, back in the mainstream. But as those arguments have sort of changed over time, you recognize that that's a function of not only the legal victories that you've won, but the larger narrative change that you've been able to accomplish. And so, that's a picture of me standing at the podium with Diane Shore when we finally survived our 3 motions to dismiss and our motions for summary judgment, and had our opening arguments in the district court here in DC. And that case, was so important because, when I had the chance to meet Diane, this is somebody who'd had an incredibly accomplished career in the military, done all of the special forces things, and was hunting Osama bin Laden and doing all these things. And when she knew that she had reached the point in her life where she needed to transition and live as her authentic self, service in the military wasn't an option at all, but thought that she could bring those skills into civilian life at the Library of Congress. And this notion that, they wanted all of the skills as long as they thought they were getting the man that they thought they were getting, and not actually Diane, who had all of the same things in her brain and all the same life experiences. This is one of those moments where, thank goodness for the paperwork of government hiring, because we could actually point to the fact that Diane had actually been, the top person for the job, until she disclosed this aspect of her identity. And all of a sudden, she wasn't a good fit, right? So it was really wonderful to be able to have somebody with such a compelling life story to be able to sort of carry forward these legal claims. She herself was somebody, who had 2 master's degrees and was able to sort of be a partner with us and sort of thinking about some of the choices that we made along the way. But we also had to litigate that case in many ways with a recognition of where the law was at that time. And we were really leaning into an area of the law that focused on how a failure to conform to stereotypical beliefs about gender is a form of sex discrimination. But we also knew that, again, there was an element of that going on here in the sense that Diane wasn't somebody who the Library of Congress, hiring official thought of as a real man or a real woman. But at the end of the day, it was her being trans, which was, this huge issue. And so we tried to figure out a way to make sure we could litigate it to give us the opportunity to chart that path forward while also grounding ourselves in the more established legal claim that we knew had been forged in Price Waterhouse back from 1989. So, being able to sort of have both of those things going on at the same time and building a record that really gave us sort of the chance to make, the more vanguard ruling, but also have this alternative basis, which wound up being really important for us actually when, we won the case and we're no longer litigating against the George W. Bush Justice Department, but we were litigating against an Obama Justice Department, and we were able to sort of say, look, we've won this case. We've got a number of bases that support the ruling. Maybe you should just take your marbles and go home and let Diane kind of get on with her life. And we were able to accomplish that for her, which of course then sort of put us on the path toward Bostock, which is, again, a huge victory, but, still something that we're still litigating what it actually is going to mean going forward in people's lives.
You talked before about, I'll never like go to the Justice Department when you were like in law school, and you just talked about litigating against the government, and then you, of course, went to the Justice Department. Did that tear at you? Like, did you feel like you were going to like the dark side, or like, what?
Oh, man.
What
You- I mean, I really did when I made the decision to go to the Justice Department, I really thought of it as essentially sort of hanging up my hat when it came to LGBTQ advocacy, right? Because at that point, it's very funny. You don't often audition for a job by sort of beating your future employer in court, but it was one of those things where it was like, okay, I had this hope that maybe this would be something that would help the government move forward, but knew, that at the end of the day, the Civil Rights Division at that point didn't have any statutes that explicitly authorized enforcement action with respect to LGBT issues other than, the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crimes Act, right? That was the only law that provided any explicit protections for LGBTQ people. So I went thinking, look, there's this whole other range of civil rights issues that are extremely important to me: race discrimination, sex discrimination, and housing, employment. And the fact that I was going to be in the appellate section was going to allow me to sort of work on all those things. But then when, 6 months into the gig, we saw a ruling come out of the District Court in Massachusetts striking down the Defense of Marriage Act, where, of course, the government and OPM specifically was the named defendant as the agency that was not granting marital benefits. All of a sudden, I kind of got this knock on the door, and I was like, hey, I know something about this. And if you're interested in the Civil Rights Division perspective on this, like, I could probably crank out a pretty awesome memo, within some short time. So, the process from that point on of being able to be on the inside and help to sort of turn the ship on that was far beyond anything that I ever anticipated. I had kind of really, like I said, thought I was going to the Justice Department to work on other areas of civil rights that were important to me. But the fact that I was able to be someone who brought that expertise inside the government and helped be part of those conversations that, in my mind, sort of brought the Justice Department into greater alignment with justice, as most of us would define it, was really an incredible opportunity.
No, as someone who's been outside of government, like I think people, you have that view, like, why can't the government just do the right thing? Like, what takes so long? And then you go inside. How did that inform your perspective of how, and even at public justice now, how you approach the government, litigate against them, and know, the world of what is possible?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because, when I first was thinking about, sort of how we could leverage the Schroer decision and the fact that the Justice Department had decided not to appeal, like, And we had an Obama administration, where we had good people, in different offices. Lane Kaplan, was there as the general counsel of OPM. And I just, my little brave self, wrote Elaine a letter. And it's just like, well, look, since the government hasn't appealed this case, then this is clearly the right interpretation of Title VII. Like, maybe OPM could just issue guidance and tell everybody in the federal government, to stop discriminating against trans people. And she was like, you're so cute. That's really funny. That's so not how this works, right? But, that piece then sort of resulted in work that was happening over at the EEOC. And of course, to the extent that the EEOC has adjudication authority over the federal sector workforce, they were able to sort of do their piece, and we were able to sort of put all those things together. So, and it's interesting because at Public Justice, we don't necessarily like litigate against the government in the way that like I had at the ACLU, where we kind of go after government wrongdoing. But I do think it's important to sort of recognize, that, when you're litigating an entity like that, there are these really entrenched sort of institutional sort of interests that often really stand in the way of justice. It's like, well, if this person wins, then other people might win too. And of course, from our perspective, it's like, right, that's the point, right? If like all of these people are experiencing discrimination, like how about we fix it for all of them and not force us to litigate it, one person at a time. But yeah, it was one of those sort of funny moments where, I kind of had this vision of like, well, we'll just win the case and then the government will do the right thing. And it was like, oh no, it's a lot more complicated than that. But I do think as well, it showed the importance of having the storytelling going along with the stories, because, it's one thing to sort of say that this is the right rule of law, and it's another thing to have a story out there about the case and about the principle that is so compelling that you have people being like, well, why isn't that the law? Like, that actually is the right answer. Like, that was the right outcome for Diane. She served her country, and the idea she's not going to get a job just because of this thing that maybe I don't even understand, but like, give me a break. Like, that's not fair, right? You need that piece too, because there's the political side of this as well as the just like logical legal side of it.
Rebuttal PR is a strategic communications firm that works exclusively with the plaintiffs' bar to market their firms and win high-stakes litigation. For more than 15 years, the nation's leading plaintiff law firms have turned to Rebuttal PR to create winning communications campaigns, ranging from billion-dollar mass torts and class actions to positioning attorneys in their markets to grow their businesses and make a bigger impact. What sets Rebuttal PR apart is the unique skill set of our team, which combines legal knowledge with public relations expertise. Our team's ability to understand the facts and law of a case, as well as the media landscape, means we can develop compelling, narrative-driven campaigns that resonate with key stakeholders and support your firm and legal strategy. Visit our website, RebuttalPR.com, to learn more. Now back to our episode. For those just tuning in, we are here with Sharon McGowan, the CEO of Public Justice. Sharon, I want to pivot a little bit now to your journey to get to Public Justice. So you're at Katz, Banks and Kumin. Like, you just get a call one day and be like, hey, you interested? Like, you want to come in and talk? And what was your, view of Public Justice at the time? What you knew about them, your impressions, and what made you want to go down the path?
Yeah, it was so interesting. I, remember when it first came on my radar screen that Public Justice was sort of in the market for a new leader, that Paul Bland, who had done an amazing job as executive director of Public Justice, had done the right thing in terms of sort of giving people runway to be able to let them know that he was planning on making this transition so that they could sort of do a fulsome search. And I think it was a few months, into that before it even sort of really had popped on my radar screen, because it wasn't necessarily something I was looking for. I was doing really meaningful plaintiff side employment work with Debbie Katz and Lisa Banks and the entire great team at Katz, Banks, Kumin. But I did know about Public Justice, in particular from my time as legal director at Lambda Legal, when I was there for 5 years leading the LGBT advocacy program there. Public Justice was always this organization that, not only you could count on to write these really whip smart briefs, but they were so smart, so solid, and obviously sort of aligned with us on issues, but yet also sort of had this other piece of their work that, if I hadn't gone to Katz Banks, I don't know that if I necessarily would have really popped for me in the same kind of way. Because for 2 years, doing individual representation of workers who had experienced discrimination, recognizing that the first question you need to ask, or maybe the third question you need to ask, is, hey, did you sign an arbitration agreement? Right? I don't know that that would have been as sort of front and center in my mind, and understanding the importance of that part of public justice's work in a way that some other parts of public justice's work around the student civil rights area, for example, had been much more prominent for me based on the areas where I had litigated. So, I had always sort of found myself and really identified with this side of the V. And so public justice in many ways was sort of righteously sort of aligned. But then also when I was able to see the areas of work that they did, and the fact that they were also identifying a different swath of bad actors that really impact our lives, that it's not just all about the government as the only bad guy, right? There are the ways in which corporations left free to their own devices will run roughshod over people. And I loved that like fighting spirit of it, of like, we are going to be the David versus the Goliath here, And so, I knew that there were some parts of my background that completely aligned substantively. I knew that there were other areas of our work that I didn't have as much deep, substantive sort of expertise, but I knew that the mission, the goal, and the fight was something that very much sort of sang to my heart. And, I always sort of say now, seeing where we are today, if I hadn't found public justice, almost a year ago, I'd be probably knocking on the door of public justice, asking them to let me in so that I could be here and be part of the fight with this great group of people.
So now it's been, almost a year that you've been CEO,
Yeah.
and you came in as a litigator, a fighter, and now you're running an organization. How has that transition been, if it has been one? Do you view it, sort of differently, like, I need to let the fighters fight and I need to have a more global view? I mean, what's that been like for you?
It's really in some ways like the best of both worlds for me, because we are still an organization that is small enough that we have these conversations about where it is that we're going to be dedicating sort of our limited resources, our limited bandwidth, right? There's no lack of incredible things that we could do. It's just finding the places that we have the best opportunity to do it. And so to the extent that I still get to be sort of engaged in those substantive conversations, that sort of kind of feeds my soul. And to the extent that I don't have to be the person who tries to kind of shave off that last 1,000 words to get the brief under the word limit, I also feel very liberated by leaving that to someone else. And then I get to sort of, read the amazing sort of end product at the end of the day. But the other thing too, that I feel like I really enjoy about this role is, I get to sort of still be in the legal world, but I also get to sort of kind of share the good news beyond, right? And to be the person who is there, says, look, you don't need to necessarily know every last sort of nuance or every last footnote of the court's most recent, Rule 23 decision. I was like, but let me tell you like why this matters, right? And to be able to be what I describe as the cheerleader in chief, as much as sort of, the sort of chief executive or staff leader of the organization, that to me is really, the place where, it is fun, and what I have to sell is so awesome, right? It's, I know for some people, the idea of having to go out and sort of, whether it's raise resources or garner support, I said, look, when I was doing plaintiff side, work, I would be writing demand letters to people who hated me, hated my client, and thought we were all pieces of shit. Whereas now I actually get to go and tell people, is that okay? Sorry, I hope a little freshness in the podcast.
It's
But now I
PG-13.
get
It's
to sort
cool.
of
It's
go out
fine.
and try to convince people to give me money where I have something really great that they want to sell, that they want to be part of, and that I can sell. So, so that's fun. That is fun too.
So, lawyers listening to this, they probably have a perception of public justice, and you obviously you must have had a perception before going inside of public justice. What surprised you once you were inside those four walls about the way the place operates or how it makes decisions about the issues that it's going to advocate on?
It's interesting coming to an organization after it has gone through its COVID transition. I was there leading Lambda's legal department while we were sort of in the midst of that, and trying to sort of deal with it all kind of in real time. And so now to be at an organization like Public Justice, sort of where we're kind of figuring out like what do we keep and from the changes that we had to make sort of post COVID, and what are the things that we're going to try to recapture. I think that's been something that's been really interesting and enjoyable to me, to sort of watch the ways in which the staff, and frankly our board as well, has tried to find that balance of staying connected, in both personal and intellectual sort of ways, recognizing that we now have a staff that is spread over, half of the states in the country, right? And so that's, I think, one of the things that's been really interesting to sort of think about, just work in general, sort of in our kind of post-COVID environment. But the other thing, I think this is something that I didn't really expect is, at the ACLU, we had, our network of state affiliates, and those were kind of like our eyes and ears on the ground. And I don't know that I fully understood or appreciated, the way in which the incredible network of thousands of lawyers who are part of the public justice family are kind of like that equivalent for us, like on the civil side, right? They're out there telling us, hey, we're starting to see this tactic, or we're starting to see this language in our contracts. Are you guys on it? And so to be able to have sort of all of this spidey sense sort of sprinkled throughout the country, and to have a hub that we can bring it together to figure out how do we, as an organization that doesn't necessarily have to figure out whether or not every case is going to pay the bills and keep the lights on, that we can kind of be there and strategically come in to make sure that the brave and fearless advocates out there have as few obstacles in their path to seeking justice for their clients as possible.
You're one of the, I guess, I'd say more vocal organizations related to the work of the Trump administration currently. And I'm curious, how do you make a decision with all that that administration is doing of what are the battlegrounds we can fight on and what are the ones where the cause is righteous, but we have to cede that for the moment?
Yeah. I mean, this is where I think it's important to engage in partnerships with other organizations that predate the crisis that you're in, right? And I'm so proud that public justice has been, both a leader and an active member of a number of coalitions. For example, we're part of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. There are a number of consumer coalitions. We've got great partners in the National Consumer Law Center, NACA, other organizations like this, where we can sort of figure out, okay, what are the things that are happening that are really within sort of our sphere of expertise that we have the ability to sort of lean in, and what are some of the things that are happening that potentially sort of impact the rule of law as a whole that isn't necessarily, sort of public justice's sort of core expertise, but where we have a role to play, whether it's an amicus or whether or not it's getting, letters to the editor in the right places to prevent some member of Congress who's a key vote from repealing a CFPB rule that, everybody wants, and there's no reason that anybody should be destroying, right? And then I think that there are some other places, again, where, we always, I think, have this, calculus of, Sharon McGowan citizen, is deeply, distressed and disturbed and concerned about things that are happening. And then, but whether or not public justice's voice or expertise is the one that's going to really move the needle, and what work do we not do if we kind of run and pile on to an area of work that is already being sort of well covered and well tended. And as long as we know that the bat phone remains open, so that we can get the call for the amicus brief or the support or the communications work, that I think is the way in which we're trying to navigate, not abandoning the part of the field that everyone is relying on us to make sure that we continue to defend, because the two worst things we could do are either one, sort of abandon the areas where we do have this expertise, or I think a problem that all of us are facing is the just curling up in a ball and just kind of being overwhelmed with despair, because then they get to just run the field, right? So I think being able to sort of be expansive in thinking about ways in which we can bring our expertise, around a number of some of the procedural issues that we work on, standing, for example, like who gets to get in court, right? That is a place where public justice has been doing that work really meaningfully for many, many years, and is likely going to be coming up in some of these cases going forward, right? So we don't necessarily have to be the organization that runs in and files the complaint to have a role to play in part of the larger work that's going on to sort of defend, our democracy and the rule of law.
What are the one or two issues that you're hearing most about from trial lawyers that they're saying to you, like public justice needs to be in the ring on these? Yeah. And I know by the time this gets published, it could be completely different issues, and it's only a couple of weeks away. It's because it's so much is happening. But I'm curious what is in the zeitgeist right now.
Well, this is, I mentioned standing in part because I think that that's sort of one of those issues where, it feels really abstract to some, but when you really kind of translate it into like who actually gets to get their foot in the door, right? And we have seen this play out in the context of, sort of federal decisions really trying to constrain this notion of who has, standing for Article 3 purposes, making sure that we are sort of limiting that, but also making sure that that doesn't sort of then have downstream effects into state courts, because a lot of the cases that our members are litigating are in state court. And so somebody once said to me, in the orange is the new black, it used to be qualified immunity as the way to keep everybody out of court, but now actually a lot of that energy is shifting to standing doctrines, right? So, that is a place where, again, it's not necessarily, the sexy sort of front page news story, but if you can't actually kind of get past, that first step, the ability to vindicate all of these other rights that are substantively so important, is going to, completely, shrivel up and diminish in really significant ways. So there's that. And then, obviously we know that class action practice is constantly sort of under attack because it is such an effective vehicle for being able to vindicate rights, particularly in the scenarios where, the corporations get to kind of do these like nickel and dimey sort of things and enrich themselves, but it's not, worth any one person sort of taking that on. We know that the Supreme Court is going to be considering a case where, we'll really need to see sort of, how much damage may happen there. And I think that's really incumbent upon us to make sure that we are engaged in not only the legal advocacy, but the public advocacy around the importance of this tool. So I think those things are going to continue to be, the places where, our members are going to look to public justice to continue to play the role that we have, both as partner and leader in terms of beating back these attempts to basically shut down access to justice for not only for, our clients, but also for our practice as a whole.
So you mentioned, not wanting to like curl up in a ball, which I think is a completely normal reaction. But you've taken on all these battles, like really on the side of David versus Goliath, and battles probably you've heard like, Sharon, why are you doing this? Like, this is like not the right time. What gives you hope every day to keep going?
I think there are a couple things. One is knowing how meaningful it is to be able, and I just think of that picture behind me, to stand there with a client. And because, even if you don't always win, the fight is so important. And so the fact that, we are able to not only, ourselves at Public Justice with our clients, whether it's a trans student in South Carolina or a woman who's gotten ripped off, by a company trying to sort of literally sell her a bill of goods, there's an element of just helping to give people agency over what's happening in their lives that I think is so important. But then, I also am a mom of two kids, right? My 12-year-old and 8-year-old. Like, I look at them and this is not negotiable, right? Like, I don't get to just curl up in a ball and hope that it'll all be fine by the time, they're adults. I mean, my 8-year-old was saying, like, why don't I get to vote in the election? It's my life. These things are all going to affect me. And I was like, 100%. And, we can have a conversation about that, but let's go and, knock on some doors and do some voter education and get people out. So, James Baldwin and so many other authors, kind of talk about the fact that we don't have the luxury of being able to give up, right? It's not our job to complete the work, right? As one of the famous, scholars will say, but shame on us if we don't do our part, when we have the opportunity to do so. So that's kind of how I'm not saying I'm in a great mood every morning, and sometimes I just need to, sort of turn off the news feed and, go build Legos with my kids. But, whatever it is that you do for your self-care, I feel really lucky that I get to get up every day and have a job that lets me sort of channel that energy. And I don't have that moment of like, I don't know what to do. Like, I know what to do. And I know that I'm doing it with some of the best and most amazing people in the country. So I feel very, very lucky.
Sharon, I really appreciate the time. To close this out, I would like you to send a message to trial lawyers who, for some reason, are not members or haven't supported public justice in the past. Please make the pitch and encourage them to do so.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that, Ray. Look, Public Justice is an organization that believes in the power of the trial bar to build a better world, right? And we believe in you. We believe in the work that you're doing, and we are here to help. But we can't do that work without your help. So whether you're a class action practitioner, a mass tort practitioner, somebody who's doing individual employment cases or personal injury cases, whatever it is that you do and that you care about, I guarantee you there's a part of what Public Justice is doing that is affecting and hopefully improving your quality of life as a lawyer in this space. So please learn more about us, and certainly please support us if you can.
Sharon McGowan, the CEO of Public Justice, thank you so much for joining the podcast. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks to everybody at RebuttalPR. You guys are great.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Raising the Bar with Rebuttal PR. Don't forget to subscribe and follow to join us next time. See you then.